So, the 2018 Academy Awards are coming up very soon, and really the whole night is just a long, extended build-up to see which film will be crowned Best Picture. And even though people like to upload their think pieces about how the Oscars don't matter, I really think they do. They're essentially a meter for how people who don't care that much about movies gauge quality. Other award shows like the Golden Globes cover films that people are generally more familiar with, but even if people never see the movies themselves, the Oscars denote a certain prestige, a certain level of quality, which is obviously arguable in some cases, but still. The Best Picture category is the crown jewel of the night because it's the most highly publicized statement in the film industry that these movies are the best movies. And so, having now seen all of the nominated films, which is a new yearly tradition I've gotten into, I'm going to share my thoughts on them because it's a fun discussion to be a part of. So, let's get into it. Here are my thoughts on the Best Picture nominees for the 2018 Oscars, starting with Call Me By Your Name is a movie that has a lot going for it. A beautiful setting, a touching story, and some well-established talent bringing a beloved book to life. Its greatest strength is the chemistry between the leads. Timothée Chalamet and Armie Hammer are fantastic together. The way they interact and how those interactions evolve feels very natural, very authentic. In terms of capturing young love, the film is spot on with the awkwardness, the jealousy, the confusion, the fear, the joy, and the ultimate sadness that comes with it. The journey of the characters is interesting enough, but nothing about this movie really grabbed my attention, really invested me in the possible outcomes. It's not incompetent by any means, and there's nothing really bad about it, it just didn't click with me the way I hoped it would. But hey, this film has spoken to a lot of people, and that's worth noting. Darkest Hour would simply be a standard historical drama if it weren't for the immense talent involved in directing and acting, both of which elevate this film to an unexpectedly engaging level. Gary Oldman's performance as Winston Churchill does a lot to sell the story. In tone, in mannerisms, in demeanor, he totally transforms in this role and brings the necessary gravitas and humanity to this iconic figure. The film doesn't make Churchill a cartoonish character. You feel the pressure he's under, the weight of every decision, and even though we only get brief glimpses at the war itself, its presence is always looming. The film has a real fluidity to it, a constant sense of motion with the camera work, and for a film that's mostly devoid of color, it's surprisingly beautiful to look at. This film covers ground that many other films have before, but a well-executed story is a well-executed story, and the team behind this one brought a lot of energy and inventiveness to the table. Dunkirk is pretty much exactly what I hoped it would be. From a technical standpoint, it's flawless, and it brings a surprising amount of emotional weight along too. The film tackles character in a very unique way by presenting these soldiers who are essentially blank slates, but the constant chaos they're thrown into creates a real connection between them and the audience. That atmosphere of desperation, of hopelessness, of fear is continually built on, showing that in the midst of war, escape can seem impossible, and the film pushes every character to their limit. The story itself plays out across 3 different timelines at 3 different rates, which I found to be an interesting, if not slightly unnecessary choice, at least until the plot lines converged. Scale is also key to what makes the film click. Each of the storylines are so contained on the beach, on a boat, or in the cockpit of a fighter plane, but everything feels so enormous. In terms of structure, this is a war film unlike any other, and even though the real-life event was a retreat, the story ends on a resounding feeling of victory. Get Out presents a perspective that isn't often seen in horror movies and uses racism as its main villain, poking fun at societal interactions and everyday prejudices. While this isn't a story I could completely emotionally connect with or fully understand, it's one that's very easy to become invested in because it's told so well, it feels so refreshing. Daniel Kaluuya propels the action forward with an intensely focused performance, reinforcing the general feeling of unease that permeates through the whole whole film. Just his nervous smile captures the movie's spirit so consistently. This is far from a straightforward horror movie though. It's closer in tone to a horror comedy, and I think that the amount they leaned into humor came at the cost of the film never quite being scary. It turns into a layered, Twilight Zone-esque science fiction tale by the end, and because it gets a little ridiculous, a little far-fetched with the story, it's hard to tell exactly how seriously we're supposed to take it. Still, the nuanced and clever social commentary pushes this story beyond being a simple, generic thriller, and this film shows that Jordan Peele has a lot of promise as a director, and I can't wait to see what he does next. Lady Bird is one of the more overhyped movies of last year because in terms of coming-of-age stories, teen dramas, or young girl discovers who she is personal journeys, it's nothing groundbreaking, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, but when Lady Bird started hanging out with the popular kids, and it turns out they're not as cool as they seemed, and her real friends were who she was always meant to be with, I just wanted more out of the story. It felt almost lazy. Originality isn't everything, but the greatest strengths of the film come from it, from its unique aspects, through the grounded, naturalistic dialogue, and especially the acting. Laurie Metcalf in particular was spectacular with this constant air of frustration and exhaustion. She easily stole the movie. The emotional beats are also fairly strong, although the central relationship between Lady Bird and her mother is the only one that has any real punch to it, but that works because it's kind of the point of the movie. Really, this film is just a solid execution of a coming-of-age story, and not much more. It didn't change my life, it didn't make me look at stories like this in a new way, it's just a charming, funny little movie. Phantom Thread is a very elegantly told love story, and a very simple one. This is a film that could very easily be seen as boring, but it had me hooked from the beginning. In the lead role, Daniel Day-Lewis truly disappeared into the eccentric, obsessive fashion designer Reynolds Woodcock, and his unwavering restraint and composure make his character all the more fascinating to follow. Paul Thomas Anderson's direction is immaculate, and the film just radiates this sense of opulence and beauty with this magnificent score that establishes an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Despite being a period piece, this feels like a timeless story because the emotion and humanity behind the characters feel so authentic and are brought to life so powerfully. Because of my previous inexperience with Anderson's work, I didn't quite know what to expect from this movie going in, but I loved it far more than I ever thought I would. It's just phenomenal. The Post is an Oscar movie in every regard. You got Steven Spielberg, Meryl Streep, Tom Hanks, and a politically charged plot. In terms of being a Spielberg period drama, it just kinda goes through the motions, which given the film's very rushed production wasn't too surprising. I mean, given that the film is based on historical events, the ending is going to be a set point, but the build up to that final decision doesn't come after a lot of tension or excitement. And the film's many connections to the current American political landscape were a touch too forced. There's a point where Tom Hanks practically turns to the camera and says, "The president doesn't decide what gets printed in the newspaper." I get it. I get it. Surprisingly though, the film ends on a note that was so unexpected and so oddly executed that it actually made me laugh out loud, so overall, it doesn't quite land as the uplifting success story it's trying to be. The Shape of Water is so bizarre, and yet so lovely, so off-putting, and yet so heartwarming. That constant state of contradiction is fascinating to me because it never made me love this movie any less. In tone, in style, in characterization, you've got so many disparate elements existing alongside each other, but the pieces just fit together so well. Everything flows so smoothly. The love story at the center of it all, as strange as it is, resonates very strongly, mainly because of Sally Hawkins' brilliantly sympathetic portrayal of a mute janitor. The connection she so desperately seeks is found in this mysterious fish creature, and even though contact between them is so limited, you feel their bond, you understand it so clearly. In terms of the film's world, the mystery around it is far more engaging than any detailed mythology would have been. Guillermo del Toro paints such a beautifully vivid, vibrant picture of every character and every location. The period setting is so ingrained engrossing with gorgeous cinematography and production design, but those elements are all the more effective because they're not used to romanticize the plot. Rather, the love and joy of the story develops in spite of the dark world around it, and that joy never goes away. Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri is the only one of these movies that I would call outright bad, and it's certainly the most polarizing of all of them. As someone who really focuses on story when watching movies, this film doesn't really have one. It feels like a bunch of non sequiturs that barely hold together, and there was no resolution to anything. There were just 50 subplots that started and went nowhere. The film just kind of chugs along, going on wild tangent after wild tangent with these unpleasant characters who are being played by great actors working with garbage material, desperately trying to make this story work. The film barely exists in reality. The characters and story don't follow any logical paths, and I'm all for subverting expectations of structure, but it's not clever here. It just feels pointless and incompetent. I just have no idea what this film is trying to be, especially in terms of tone. There were times when it would be dark and grim and it was starting to gain momentum, and then the seriousness would be undercut by a terrible, goofy joke that just killed the moment. I found this film actively frustrating to watch because every time it would start to be interesting, it would be ruined so quickly. Frances McDormand does an amazing job, but everything else about this film is so poorly handled that I can't understand why people love it so much. It's just a mess. So, those are my thoughts on all of the Best Picture nominees for the 2018 Oscars, and in terms of a prediction for a winner, I think it's actually a pretty tight race. It's hard to call. I mean, the 2017 Best Picture race was only ever really between Moonlight and La La Land, but the choices aren't as predictable this year, which is exciting. If I had to make a guess, I would say either Lady Bird or Get Out will probably win because those have had the most momentum behind them, the most push. Power Rangers wasn't even nominated, so I'm pretty sure this whole thing is rigged anyway. Of all the nominees, I hope that Phantom Thread wins, even though I really don't think it will. I think it's the best one, and the one that I would hate to see win would be Three Billboards, obviously. If Three Billboards wins, it would be another Crash situation, which is to say, an embarrassing end to the night. But hey, you can't get much more embarrassing than last year's end to the night, so that's a plus. So, those are my thoughts, and we'll have to wait until that fateful night to see which film takes home the big prize. And then people can tweet and argue incessantly about how blank was robbed or blank was snubbed until the next Oscars come around. Because Denis Villeneuve was snubbed and Blade Runner 2049 was amazing, it made me cry, and the Academy are a bunch of dumb motherfuckers.